I know it's very late in the evening now and everyone is a bit tired, but we'll go through this quickly and I hope it's going to be interesting. The paper that I'm presenting is called Housing as Process Towards a Multisectorial Approach to Urban Poverty Reduction in Khartoum, which sounds like a little bit of everything, but I'm going to try to break that down. My name is Tasneem Nagi. I'm an architect by profession, moving towards the field of development now. And I'm here representing myself and my colleague, Budoor Bukhari, who sadly couldn't be here today. So what I'm trying to do, what this paper argues for is the fact that housing is a very effective tool in addressing urban poverty in the Sudanese context, in general, but also in the Sudanese context. And to do that, I'm going to go through several points. So first, although I'm an architect, I'm going to do a bit of deconstruction here. First, I'm going to problematize how we understand poverty in general and the trends of us understanding poverty. And then I'm going to move into problematizing what housing is and how we understand housing. And then I'm going to try to bridge the gap between the two fields and see how they go together. So bear with me. At the end, I'm going to conclude about the role of what we're here today, the role of Sudanese academic and research institutions in general in these two fields and in this critical point. A bit of context first. I'm speaking about Khartoum, and Mr. Al-Faki found like the official resources says that 48% is the poverty rate in Sudan. A lot of us might find that questionable. The reality is poverty rates are way beyond what the official things say. An estimate made by Hamid and Al-Hassan in 2014 says that 80% of households in Greater Khartoum are classified as lower income. This is a distinct form of poverty that's urban poverty, poverty in cities rather than general trends of poverty. And so 60%, beyond that, there's a huge deficit in housing. All of us struggle for housing in Khartoum. Almost everyone is struggling for housing in Khartoum. 60,000 units per year is a huge number to have like lacking in housing. Beyond that, movement towards cities is increasing. We have the highest internally displaced people rates in the world in Sudan, estimated at 5 million people in 2008. 40%, the same paper estimated that 40% of Khartoum's population are internally displaced people, with all of the vulnerabilities that come with internal displacement. So, this is the local context, Khartoum. Zooming out a bit, we have the Millennium Development Goals. It's already 2015, and this is the list of things that we should have been sort of doing by now. The first one is to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. And then it moves into to achieve universal primary education, gender equality, child mortality, reducing child mortality, maternal health, combat, etc., etc. My question is, and what I'm questioning is, isn't all of these other points part of poverty? Isn't lack of education a form of poverty? Isn't child mortality also a form of poverty? Lack of accessibility to other services also forms of poverty? So I agree with Ms. Nahla that as architects, we think in pictures, we think in spaces, we think in visually. So let's think about what these icons represent for an actual person living in Khartoum today. Presented here, Hawa. Let's say Hawa is a person from South Kordofan who moved to Khartoum as an internally displaced person. She lives in an informal settlement, Sakan Ashwa'i, in Khartoum, and she has, in a very compacted, overcrowded space. She has no access to water, no access to electricity, which means that she has to pay extra to access basic services, buying money from donkey water vendors, for example. So these are all forms of deprivation, but there are other forms of deprivation that usually do not get accounted when we look at poverty. For example, the sense of isolation, by breaking the social relations that you have back home and then you come into the city. This is also a sort of, the social structures also count as a safety net. Another form of poverty is the insecurity of the asset base. So let's say that you have a piece of land back home and you used to farm it every year to get money. And now you cannot access that piece of land because of conflict, for example. That means that your asset base extremely vulnerable. Any shock, if she gets sick, there is no asset base, there is no safety net for her. So vulnerability is also a form of poverty. So theorists like Chambers and Satterthwaite have been including social inferiority, vulnerability, isolation, seasonality, all as expanding our understanding of poverty. So, but how does poverty is measured now? How is poverty measured today? We have the famous $1 a day poverty line set by the World Bank. If you get $1 a day, you're not poor. If you have less than that, you're probably poor. So what does that not account for? It does not account for, first, the socially based forms of poverty. So for example, theorists have found that the female-headed households are disproportionately presented in poor people. People lack access to a lot of things because of their gender, lack access to a lot of things because of their ethnicity. That is also a very important factor that should be accounted into poverty. So if we say that everyone who owns less than $1 a day, we assume that everyone who's poor are exactly the same, and they have, which is not necessarily the true or the case. And we disregard all of these things, all of these fronts that need to be addressed if we want to reduce poverty in general. Another thing, it also dismisses the diverse levels of poverty. Not all poor people are exactly living the same kind of condition of poverty, and each person is going to be tackled, each kind of poverty is going to be tackled from a different front, and it's not going to be one cookie-cut solution for everyone. So, to sort of summarize all of that, poverty is not only about money at all, although economics is a very important factor in poverty and can give us a sense of its trends. However, it's also related to social relations. It's also related to the sense of threat and security that you have in your being. For example, living in an informal settlement, it means every day you're facing the threat of eviction. You could have just be kicked out from where you are every day. If you have an informal kind of job, it's also like all of these factors play into poverty. Which leads to another point that I want to stress. So the condition of poverty is lived in such a variety of ways that we cannot define it, because who is a better expert on poverty than the poor? So we cannot really define the concept of poverty or design strategies for its eradication without the participation of the poor themselves to define their priorities, what aspect of poverty do they experience, and how do we design a process to overcome that. So here I come to my hypothesis of this paper. Housing, understood as a holistic process, so I'm going to problematize housing, is a strategic tool in addressing urban poverty in Khartoum. It is, personally, I think it is the most strategic tool in addressing urban poverty in Khartoum. But let's see why. Where does poverty occur? Nothing happens in vacuum. Everything takes spatial forms. For poverty, there are socio-spatial manifestations. Every space is contested. So if we look into Khartoum, poverty does appear in space. It's not only an idea, an abstract. It's not people who are poor and people who aren't as free-floating in a market. No, it takes spatial manifestations. Why housing? Because it's one of the major concerns within our context in Sudan today. And an approach to housing can be an approach to spatial planning in general. So how do we provide housing today in Khartoum? Most people are left to the market. You try to buy a piece of land, you try to build your house, you work for 10, 20 years in order to establish a house and have a space in Khartoum. But what options do the people who can never afford that have? So first of all, the most obvious and easiest option is informal housing. You go, you squat a piece, you find an empty piece of land, you squat it, you build shanty house out of, bags, out of corrugated metal sheets, out of everything that you can get your hand on, and you live there. But other than that, luckily we have housing policies in Khartoum. We provide either sites and services, which are empty plots of land that are allocated to people who are below a certain level of income, and over the years there has been several modes of that. And there's also the core housing schemes, which provide, because when these plots of land were being allocated, we realized that people were given land, but without, it's called sites and services schemes, but people were given sites without any services. So what happens is, there's a, which is usually the case, there's an informal settlement in a space, someone else claims the land, everyone gets evacuated and kicked out of where they are. They're allocated a piece of land way out of the city, out of their livelihoods, out of everything that they know. And then this is your site, and the government has provided you a piece of land, which in theory, yes, you provided land, but then does that help solving poverty? Does that solve the problem? And that's the question that I'm proposing now. Another obstacle to that is that if you don't have papers, if you're really vulnerable and you don't have enough papers, you cannot even apply to that process, and oftentimes you're not really recognized. The other mode of housing provision is the on-site upgrading, which happened in several cases. And in that case, what happens is there's an informal settlement, there's no dispute over the land, people are living there. What the government does is they regulate, or the housing department does is they regulate the roads and give people land tenure, and they own their lands, and that's where you sort of are officially recognized as the landowner of that space. But without any regard to sort of other aspects of that settlement. So what happens is someone sprays Izala, I'm sure a lot of you have seen it around Khartoum, and then this wall is taken out, and then you're sort of asked to build a wall there. So what I'm trying to propose is a house is not what it looks like. It's not, I don't know, this house looks really poor, this house looks really nice. No, a house is what it does for its residents. So why do people choose to live in informal settlements? Because it's close to where they work, because it's accessible, because they can find some sort of security there, and because it's affordable to who they are. And the urban poor really, studies, scholars after scholars, prove that the urban poor are very rational in their responses to their own poverty, because they know and they can make very limited resources go a very large way. So what I'm proposing is to reconceptualize the way we think about housing. When our housing is a provision kind of thing, like all of these urban poor, we need to house all of them. So what we do is we split pieces of land and we give it to each one individually. This theory means the more poor they are, the more burden for us to provide their housing. So the poor are looked at a negative light, as a burden to the government. What I want to propose is to looking at housing as a process of rethinking the city as a whole, and looking at the social structures and why people come to certain spaces and live there. And then what does these spaces represent to the city as a whole? And then through this, we can look at the poor as assets, because A, they're experts on poverty, B, they have the social structures that support their lives to begin with, and if we tap into what's already happening and give resources there, we can use less resources and get more benefits out of it. So very briefly, there are 4 main principles that such a housing policy has. A, to build on social structures, which means multisectoriality and inclusivity. In what sense? Multisectoriality in the fact that you go into, you identify the social structures that already exist within a community, and then you tackle it from different fronts. So it's not only about the house. You look at the community, not the individual. And then you analyze that community based on, you analyze the needs of the community, you look at the problematics of the space, and then you design around that a housing scheme that better fits it. So this might look like a 1-by-1 and a very long process. So in order to scale that up, we have to also recognize the participation of the poor into the provision of housing at an institutional level. I'm going to go very briefly. These are images from a research project that I was doing a few weeks ago in Cambodia, actually. And what's happening in that country is exactly that. In conditions of extreme poverty, the urban poor themselves were able to map their neighborhoods, and which are spaces that no one else knows what's happening inside. Map their neighborhoods, identify the problems of recurrent flooding, come up with new master plans, present them to the government. The government was able to include those, but it didn't stop there. The knowledge that came out of this exercise was analyzing the flooding patterns every year. So they were able to come up with a proposal for a draining system for the whole city, just out of the knowledge that comes out from one informal settlement. And this idea is not new to Sudan. We all know what nafir is, right? The whole of the community comes together to build something, right? And the mode of housing as process is exactly that. It's coming together, sharing a space, explaining the problematics of the space, and then addressing all of these problematics both spatially and socially. So to conclude, what are the role of the community organizations, civil society, Sudanese academic and research institutions in doing this? I was trained as an architect at the University of Khartoum, and everything that I was taught looked more towards like what's on the above. How we study architecture in Khartoum is in Sudan in general, is very detached from the urban realities and what's happening in reality. Both Budoor and I were trained as architects in Sudan, and then when we stepped out of Sudan, out of the university and working in Sudan, we realized that what we were doing wasn't really adding up to what's happening in the world, right? So what we did is we went back to even the academics, my professors, my teachers at the university, and I realized a wealth of knowledge that they have researching urban realities, urban poverty, housing policies, etc., etc. But that is not incorporated into what we study at school. Why? And I think research, there's a huge area of research and even exchange with other parts of the world where these modes of housing are really predominant and they really, really work. Thank you very much.